Today we're going to start option E, neurobiology and behavior, and our first lesson in this series is E1, stimulus and response. Let's start by defining our terms. Have you ever been tickled before? If you have, then you know that when someone tickles you, you feel something. They're external to you and they're going to be touching you and they're going to be setting off sort of a trigger on you that you feel. That's called the stimulus. And then the fact that you giggle or laugh or try to move away from them is your response to that stimulus. In this slide, there's a picture of a person tickling someone's toes with feathers. What's the stimulus in this case? The stimulus are the feathers, and the response would be the wiggling of the toes. Sometimes a stimulus and response are paired together in a predictable sequence. For example, a sneeze. So if pepper or some other type of irritant makes it into your nasal passages and stimulates certain receptors in your olfactory system, then your body will respond by sneezing. And that's pairing a stimulus with a response, and that's called a reflex. Other examples of reflexes are the irises in your eyes opening and closing in response to light. And also that when you hit your kneecap and your leg responds by moving forward, that's something that is sort of hardwired in your body, pre-programmed. It's not something that you control. If your body is exposed to that stimulus, it will respond in a predictable way. How does your body record or receive a stimulus? Well, it does it with specialized neurons called receptors. And in this picture, which is a cross-section of human skin or epidermis, it actually color codes and shows the different types of receptors or neurons which are present in the skin. The green one is a receptor for cold, the pink pain, purple pressure, and yellow heat. Keep in mind that all of these are actual specialized neurons. They are the very first neurons in that linear sequence of receiving a stimulus and sending it to our central nervous system for processing. Here's another diagram of sensory neurons showing a cross-section of the epidermal tissue of the skin. And you can see there are thermoreceptors, Meissner's corpuscle, nociceptor, and Pacinian corpuscle. A corpuscle is basically an area where the dendrites of that specialized sensory neuron are housed. And that's sort of ground zero for where that sensation will first be received. What is this a picture of? It's actually a cross-section of the spinal column, and it's showing the different neurons associated with a reflex arc. In the IB curriculum, they refer to sensory neurons which receive the signal and motor neurons which send the response to your muscles. But I just wanted to point out here that, that some scientists use the terms afferent and efferent neurons. So afferent is a sensory neuron. In other words, it's being affected by a sensation, and efferent is the motor neuron. It is going to affect something, make something happen. And of course that interneuron is housed right there in the gray matter tissue of the spinal column. Here's a more complex picture of the reflex arc, and it's color coded. The blue are the sensory neurons, and the red are the motor neurons, or effectors. Let's refresh our memory on synapses. We see a synapse here What are those red dots? The red dots are actually neurotransmitters, and that's the point, that's the gap in between the terminal of the first neuron and then the dendrites of the second neuron, and it's that point in the synapse where that electrical impulse is actually converted into a chemical messengering system. Once the neurotransmitters dock onto the receptors, then the action potential continues in an electrical manner down the axon of the next neuron. And here's a kind of a summary of the whole thing put together. Remember that this particular lesson is about stimulus and response, so we can see that there's some type of initial stimulus. It's picked up by the receptor. The receptor transmits it to the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron then brings it to the interneuron, or the association neuron as they call it in this picture, and that's going to be the switching station where it's going to continue the message up the CNS, up the spinal column, towards the brain. But if there is a reflex, it's also going to immediately move forward to that red area and cause a reflex response from the motor neuron to the effector muscle. The interesting thing is, from the perspective of natural selection and alleles and genotypes, we're used to thinking of nature or natural selection selecting on physical phenotypes, let's say traits such as tallness, darkness, lightness. Interestingly enough, natural selection can also select on behaviors. And IB wants you to know two examples of this. The first one here is bird hatchlings. So imagine that there's this sort of continuum, this bell curve of cheeping ability. There are some birds that are born that may cheep 2 or 3 times in a 15-second span. Then there may be others that cheep 7 or 8 times in a 15-second span. And then there might be birds that cheep once every second or 14 or 15 times in that same time period. So there will be a bell curve of behavioral responses. And one might gather, which chick do you think is going to be fed the most food? Well, wouldn't it make sense, you know the expression squeaky wheel gets the most grease? That the bird that cheeps the most is going to get the most attention. Well, if that's the case, then the higher cheeping bird, or the more frequently cheeping bird, is going to get better food and better nutrition, and it's going to be more likely to grow up and survive and produce its offspring. And over generations, you should see the frequency of cheeping should increase, or the mean value of that bell curve will move up a numerical continuum, so that, let's say, in the span of several thousand years, when the average cheeping might have been 2 or 3 in 15 seconds, several thousand years later, it could be 12 or 13. Another example of natural selection selecting on behavior would be aggressive male lions. People are born with different levels of passivity and aggression, so some lions are going to be more aggressive than others, and it would make sense, it would be logical to infer from that more aggressive lions would be more likely to win battles with other lions and would be more likely to land the female to mate with. And if that's the case, then nature is going to select upon that trait, because the offspring, since the father was an aggressive male rather than a passive male, the offspring are more likely to be aggressive. And then we should see over time that the mean value of aggression should also increase. So the whole point here being that natural selection over time, evolution, not only selects on physical traits, but also on behavioral traits.